During a ceasefire that feels more like a tripwire than a truce, the world holds its breath between Islamabad and the Strait of Hormuz. This is no longer just about silencing the guns. It's about whether the global order itself, its laws, its institutions, and its energy lifelines can withstand a war many now see as both illegitimate and unwinnable. Talks are hanging by a thread. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has left Islamabad after delivering Tehran's demands, while planned indirect talks involving Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff were abruptly cancelled by Donald Trump. At sea, tensions are surging. The Strait of Hormuz is on edge amid a U.S. naval blockade, Iranian seizures of vessels, and a Pentagon shoot-to-kill order. Commercial shipping is slowing to a near halt. Meanwhile, the occupation presses on with strikes in southern Lebanon, and politically, the backlash is growing. Spain's Pedro Sanchez is leading criticism of Western double standards as energy markets brace for major disruption. A confrontation is taking place, one that pits America first against the restless international community. We take you now to the heart of the crisis with our distinguished panel shortly on All 24 News Special. Hello there and welcome to All 24 News Special. And before we bring in our guests, let's follow this report that highlights the tensions between Iran and the United States as planned talks collapse and uncertainty grows over the next step in this conflict. Here's Zahra Frajani.
A new setback for diplomacy begins between Iran and the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump has cancelled a planned visit by his delegation to Islamabad just hours after Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi left to the Pakistani capital. This move pushes a second round of direct talks back to square one, amid growing uncertainty over whether negotiations will resume. Trump says the cancellation does not mean a return to war, but it raises fresh doubts about the diplomatic path forward.
I just canceled the trip of my representatives going to Islamabad, Pakistan to meet with the Iranians. Too much time wasted on traveling, too much work, besides which there is tremendous infighting and confusion within their leadership. Nobody knows who is in charge, including them. Also, we have all the cards. They have none. If they want to talk, all they have to do is call.
The scrapped visit was expected to include U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Meanwhile, Araghchi has continued his regional tour, heading to Muscat after delivering Iran's response to U.S. proposals to Pakistani officials. Tehran says any future talks depend on Washington's willingness to meet its conditions, including easing restrictions on Iranian ports. Iran also made clear there are no plans for direct meetings with U.S. envoys at this stage. In Washington, however, pressure is building. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says Iran now faces what he calls a historic opportunity to reach a serious agreement, warning that the ongoing conflict is disturbing global energy flows, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz.
On this core mission, America's will is unshakable, our capabilities unmatched. Our blockade is only growing and going global. And as the president said, we have all the time in the world. Iran has a historic chance to make a serious deal, and the ball is in their court. Either way, the War Department stands ready for what comes next, locked and loaded.
For now, diplomacy remains on hold, with both sides signaling readiness, but no clear path back to the negotiating table.
And to dissect this volatile matrix, we have assembled a panel of distinguished experts. From Ontario, Canada, we're joined by Dr. Khalid El-Qasimi, author and professor of international relations and political philosophy. Good to see you again on the show, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
A pleasure. And from London, we welcome Dr. Irfan Raja, political analyst and media specialist who has been tracking the battle of narratives shaping this conflict. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Raja.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
And from Manama, Bahrain, we're joined by Dr. Ahmed Khuzai, founder and political consultant at Khuzai Associates, LLC, based in Washington, D.C., bringing us the pulse of the Gulf Street and the region's power dynamics. Great to have you again on the show.
Always a pleasure being here.
Thank you. And from Budapest, we welcome Professor Erjabat and Roja, Middle East and Iran security expert, who will help us decode Tehran's strategic doctrine. Hello there, Professor. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Our pleasure. All right, let's begin with a paradox of a negotiation process that seems designed to fail, according to analysts and observers. Dr. Raja, the White House describes this moment as a historic opportunity, yet deploys Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner to a table Iran refuses to sit at directly. Then we receive the news that President Donald Trump canceled their trip. Is this a serious diplomatic track, or, as a recent think tank analysis suggests, this is more like an intentional collapse of diplomacy designed perhaps to buy time for military reconfiguration?
Well, thank you very much for putting this very important question. Well, given the track record of Israel and the Americans' negotiations, whenever they come on the negotiation table, and not the first time, if you look back into the history of Palestine and when they were negotiating with the Taliban, the Pakistanis were there, and almost every time, if you apply a microscopic lens, and then you come to a point that there was some cases of assassinations, some kind of all these kinds of tactics involved. So based on that, there's enough evidence, and you have rightly said, and I would definitely buy the idea of the think tank saying that it's an intentional collapse of the diplomacy because it has been skillfully designed to buy time. However, there are still hopes for peace because the ordinary people in the world, and I always say this, and I'm happy to repeat my words, that ordinary people, including you and I, in the streets, they don't want war. War is just is an agenda, is for people in power or military, industrial complex. So coming back to this, yes, I would agree with this. Unfortunately, that there is an intentional collapse of diplomacy, but still, because this time the Iranians are not all alone. I have been saying, and many experts, several leading experts around the world, believe, and there is evidence that Iranians are not all alone. They are being backed by Russians and Chinese and their friends in the region. So that all want peace. So on that, I would end this. I would believe that there is still a hope, although it might be a very little hope, and but we look forward to it.
Mm-hmm. Let's hope for the best. But meanwhile, Professor Roja, Pakistan's military leadership is now acting as the global firefighter, securing a ceasefire extension that Donald Trump himself called unlikely hours before. Now, from Iran's strategic perspective, does engaging through Pakistan allow Tehran to reconstruct its axis of resistance leverage while forcing Western powers into a positional disadvantage? I mean, is this ceasefire a reloading, let's say, phase?
It is a very interesting question. I think reloading is necessary for both sides. There came a moment when practically war had to be stopped because of the people, but because of also getting it nowhere, so having no real results. It is very interesting that Pakistan has come to play such a very important role. And there are several reasons of that. And in the meanwhile, we see that there is a kind of a reconfiguration in the region. It is not just Pakistan, but we may recall that a few days ago, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Kingdom, and Pakistani leaders were sitting together in Islamabad. So there is a kind of a rearrangement. But if that means that Iran takes the chance to reload and to restart, as you mentioned, the axis of resistance, I am not very sure. The axis of resistance, namely those state and non-state or even semi-state actors who were in a kind of a networking process with Iran, having relations, very good relations to Iran, they have been weakened very much, one by one, in consequence, I would say, of the war in Gaza that started in 2023. And I think that war, the Gaza war, was at the very beginning of the developments that we are seeing today. So the members of this so-called axis of resistance are very much weakened. Hezbollah is even fighting a war against Israel in Lebanon now, not to mention Gaza and the Hamas. But there is one issue which is very important. None of these actors will disappear. So they are there. Their relationships may return, may be strengthened, in spite of the fact that now many of those networks are hesitant, maybe a little bit towards Iran. On the other hand, there have been some studies which propose that maybe the Shiite communities may have a new revival.
Thank you for that. And now let me bring in Dr. Khuzai to the conversation. Dr. Khuzai, we're seeing a staggering scene. A U.S. blockade has virtually halted the Strait of Hormuz, slashing hence Qatari and UAE LNG production by roughly 10 billion cubic meters in a month. And given that U.S. energy exports are hitting record highs to fill this very void, how do we distinguish between sanctions enforcement and a deliberate act of economic war that Europe is now beginning to resent?
Well, Washington frames it as a tool to pressure Iran. I mean, the collateral impact on the Gulf's LNG exports and Europe's energy security is fueling a big resentment from the Europeans, especially towards the American side. Now, Europe sees the record high energy exports filing the void left by the Qataris and the Emiratis LNG. We have to understand that both Qataris and Emiratis together basically supply the international market with 20% of its needs today. Although the Emirates is more diversified than the Qataris took a bigger hit than everybody else when it comes to that. Iran itself does not produce or basically make a significant production towards the world needs, yet the disruption was mostly internal, since most of their plants were, went into wreckage by the American and the Israeli attacks. Now, where will that lead us? Basically, we have to combine this along with the oil situation by the blockade, where we have to understand as well that the entire Gulf supply forms another 20% to the world's needs. So it's not just the gas, it's the oil and gas. So we're talking about a major energy requirement that's been cut off from the international markets. With that, even if the blockade stops tomorrow, we have to understand that the majority of the plants, the majority of the supply chain has been disrupted by the war. It will take a long time. We're talking about between 3 months, 6 months, and even 1 year for some of the facilities to reconstruct and go back to full-fledged. That will leave the international market in a big void as we speak.
Thank you for that. And now let me move to Dr. El-Qasimi. Dr. El-Qasimi, President Donald Trump and threatening Iran, actually, he said that he would annihilate an entire civilization. And the UN Secretary General has explicitly warned the EU against double standards in applying international law. Now, amidst what is happening, is this the final nail in the coffin of the post-World War II international legal framework? And if the ICJ cannot stop a genocide in Gaza and the UN Charter cannot actually stop a blockade in Hormuz, what order is the West claiming to defend here?
Again, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with your guests. I think what we're watching right now is not the sudden collapse of the post-World War II international legal system. I think it is the collapse of the belief or the illusion that it ever functioned in the first place. Okay. So the United Nations Charter, the Geneva Conventions, the International Court of Justice, they were always actually built on a contradiction. They claimed to be universal, while major powers like the United States never actually intended to be fully bounded by them. And that tension was not accidental, and this is not hyperbole. It was actually structural. The way the system was built after World War II, and that's usually what happens when you win a war, you tend to place the rules and you place the structure. So for decades, that contradiction was managed through different narratives, different discourses. So we all remember the United States and its allies always framing their power through the language of like human rights, democracy, civilization, and a so-called rules-based order. And these narratives were always interest-driven, and they mattered because they sustained the illusion. It was like if you want, a magical illusion, if you will, for moral coherence, because law is a moral anchor. So they made unequal enforcement seem principled, when in reality it was simply geopolitical interest. So what has changed now is that the illusion is no longer sustainable. Okay. And this goes back to the second part of your question, where you mentioned Antonio Guterres in, I think, March 2024. He stood in Brussels and told publicly and actually accused the European Union of applying double standards in international law. And he pretty much said, for our viewers who don't remember, back to 2024, he was pretty much telling them, you should take a position on what's happening in Gaza. Okay, you took a position during the Ukrainian war. Very clearly, you were anti-Russia. Okay, so because of violations of international law, well, now you should state your claim. Mm-hmm. So when the head of the United Nations comes out openly and says this, the problem is no longer rhetorical. He's clearly signaling something foundational in the international system. So, and you see the same dynamic in the Strait of Hormuz. The United Nations Charter is clear on blockades and the use of force, but again, enforcement, because we're still working with the old system, okay, it runs through the Security Council, and the Council operates on power politics and not the law. So finally, I would say when people ask about what Western order is being defended, the honest answer, I think the honest answer is that it is no longer a universal legal order, nor even a convincing moral one. Okay, it's a strategic order, and that order protects certain alliances and sustains certain narratives, even though these narratives have collapsed under their own contradictions. And lastly, I would say this is not to say that international law is meaningless. International law, as an associate professor of international relations and political science, I think it's very important for our viewers to understand that international law is extremely important. It shapes legitimacy, it mobilizes states. It's literally a historical archive for history and for accountability. So what is fading is the assumption that the United States can mobilize or monopolize legal language, moral authority, and kind of force everybody to follow suit. I think that is eroding, and that is precisely the selectivity that is now no longer sustainable, because it's extremely obvious since the genocide in Gaza that international law does not stand when it comes to power politics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Al-Qasimi. And since, Dr. Al-Qasimi, you mentioned alliances and strategic, perhaps, realliances, let me bring Dr. Raja with this question. Dr. Raja, the America First base is actually fuming from the reports that we're hearing, calling this a proxy war for Zionist interest that betrays U.S. nationalist principles. Yet we see Israel's right-wing elements frame this ceasefire as a dangerous retreat. How explosive, according to you, is this internal divide for the Trump administration? And does it make the historic opportunity, or does it make the historic opportunity for peace a political impossibility? Dr. Raja?
Thank you very much. First of all, there's a can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, I would say, Dr. Al-Qasimi, Professor Al-Qasimi, I agree with his points. Unfortunately, the UN Security Resolution, if you look into in this year, 2026, since the Israeli invasion of Gaza, there have been, according to Al Jazeera reports, there have been over 50 times, or nearly 50 times, the Americans have willfully, blocked the veto. They're using their veto power to shield Israel from what is Israelis are doing. So on the whole, it's when we see these international organizations, United Nations, they have lost their status, and to a point that is leading experts are arguing that it's time to rethink their role. And because we have double standards, this phrase is losing its currency as well, because how many times people see this happening? You look back into the war on Iraq on the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, and similar other wars, which you has waged on countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. So the UN has lost completely, or if not, is the governments are not, especially towards in the Middle East and global South, people are not happy about it. On media, I wouldn't say. Media, I always say, is polemic. Most investigative journalism is not happening according to standards or our expectations, but it's not dead. It's still there. And we still have liberal and entities. For example, the Guardian here in England. So to an extent, the journalism is still happening. The journalists are there. Look into the Gaza. How many? Over 200 have sacrificed their lives for truth. So the journalists and the journalism is still there. It's the unfortunately, the powers that pretend, or that they present themselves as custodian of democracy, as Professor Al-Qasimi was saying. So it's almost these notions of human rights, justice, equality, democracy is almost dead. Why? Because it's all happening before our eyes.
But Dr. Raja, my initial question was about the division that we are witnessing in the America First base in the United States. I wanted to know, according to you, how explosive is this internal divide for the Trump administration, and does it make perhaps the historic opportunity for peace a political impossibility?
Well, I must say that they are on a suicidal ladder, the Israelis and Americans, because continuously threatening a sovereign power is almost a crime. And as you see that these kind of divisions were already there among these countries. I'll take you back, like your audience and viewers, to the Iraq War. Here in London, there were over a million march. We called it Million March. So the people, like the real democracy, by the people, for the people, to the like that didn't happen because the people, those who are in charge, they didn't listen to the people who were against war. Look at what is happening now in the streets of London, because we have a crackdown on so-called pro-Palestinian. This phrase is also very controversial and contested because the reason is one set of people are being skillfully portrayed as terrorists. So the whole point is there are divisions. Yes, you are right, and but it's difficult to predict whether these divisions would work in favor of peace or not, because as I gave you examples in the past, it didn't work. So we hope for the peace. We hope it works. These division works.
All right. And
Like Joe Kent has. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. And meanwhile, my question goes to you, Professor Roja. Let's talk a little bit about security analysis here on the weaponization of energy. The IEA warns of structural supply loss of up to 120 billion cubic meters of LNG through 2030. So if the EU, which is already suffering from this chaos, splits from Washington's hardline approach, as suggested actually by Chancellor Mertz's push to ease sanctions, does that actually shelter the unified Western Front? And how does Iran interpret that fracture, according to you?
Well, frankly speaking, from Iran's point of view at the moment, the European Union is sidelined. As much as the EU was taking a leading role in 2015 with the JCPOA, when it was the main negotiator in the last phase, by now the EU has lost a lot of credibility. And this loss of credibility is not just because of the Gaza war and Israel and the relations with Israel, as has been mentioned here before, but also another issue. For the European Union, the past 4 or 5 years, the biggest threat was the Russian war in the Ukraine. And when we were discussing, especially in my country, Hungary, for example, we were absolutely exposed to oil and gas coming from Russia. There has been a lot of discussions on diversification of imports and so on and so forth. So when we look at the Persian Gulf and you look at the figures, you would see that the EU is still not the biggest importer from the Gulf. Therefore, the need is a little bit relatively less. But we have heard even President Trump last week, I think he made 2 remarks. Once he said that all those Iranian oil that is already on sea, well, okay, that is exempted from sanctions. And also there was some kind of exemptions towards Russian oil that may come or go around the world. So these were probably the beginning ideas that gave the idea to Chancellor Merz. The EU leaders had a meeting, an informal meeting yesterday, I think in Cyprus, and sorry, and there he launched this idea that maybe if there seems to be a realistic chance that there could be an agreement, a peace deal with Iran, then EU sanctions could be lifted or gradually. These sanctions usually were about human rights, the nuclear issue, and the military support that Iran was giving to Russia in our resistance and support to Ukraine in its war against Russia. So this is a very complicated situation. However, I have to note that there was not an agreement among the 27 EU leaders. By the way, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who is outgoing now, was not present. But the idea was raised. It was not put forward as a real proposal, but there was some discussion on it. And still, it is not an issue officially on the agenda, and it is postponed. So this is one more point, while from the Iranian point of view, I don't think that the EU features at this precise moment as a reliable partner or as an actor who can really help solve the issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Professor Roja. Now, Dr. Khuzai, if we come to analyze what's happening in the United States from the US side, we see Trump blaming Iran alone for the moribund ceasefire, accusing it of trying to keep the strait open only to take in the 500 million US dollars a day. But isn't it the Western-backed blockade, not Iranian choice, that is the one starving Iran of cash and starving the world of stability? And who exactly is holding the energy weapon according to your own analysis?
Well, both sides are holding pieces of the energy control here. I mean, with Iran holding geography, the West holds finance and enforcement. The real question is which lever bites harder? The threat of closing the strait, of course, or the reality of sanctions itself that already limit Iran's oil revenues and the daily life of the Iranians as well. We have to acknowledge that the Iranians are suffering. Before delving into it, we have to acknowledge that the fact that Iran was the one who started the blockade to start with. What's happening right now is, on one hand, is the American response, which is affecting the Gulf states and hence the rest of the world. But as well, if we think about it, what else could have been done here? I mean, when he blames Iran to start with, we have to understand who is he blaming, because before the war, Iran had a proper hierarchy. Today, that does not exist. And with the latest news coming out of Iran, we see that the military or the IRGC are taking over. That means we have to expect more vicious responses from the Iranians and not thought through or diplomatic. That is one of the biggest problems we have. When it comes to the global fallout, we're talking, about the blockade that doesn't starve Iran of cash only. It as well destabilizes the energy markets around the world. The prices are insecure on one hand. The food supply was caused by that and disrupted, as well as weaponized, as you mentioned in your question. My last point here would be what's Iran's leverage on the whole thing. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical checkpoints. That's applied here and agreed upon. Yet, roughly, 1/5 of the oil and gas supply go through it. With that being in hand, even if Iran is being pressured today, they still hold more cards than otherwise. They know what they have and they know the threats, but the threats are affecting everybody, not Iran only.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of other nations, let me bring now Dr. Al-Qasimi. Dr. Al-Qasimi, if we look at the broader tapestry, we see nations from the global south and blocs like BRICS characterizing this aggression as a rogue U.S. aggression, with the U.S. actually failing 4 times to get congressional approval for this war and also struggling to sell it, perhaps even to NATO allies. So could this war be the catalyst that ends the unipolar moment and accelerates perhaps a non-Western global order?
Well, that narrative of the conflict being labeled as aggression, it has gained traction. And if I may, I would also mention global north countries. So countries like Spain, France, Italy, they might not have said the United States is being aggressive, but they have stated that this war shouldn't have happened the way it did. They should have given diplomacy a chance. I think Donald Trump yesterday said that he wants to kick Spain out of NATO. So it does show you that there is a lot of discourses and that the United States doesn't necessarily have control over its NATO allies or Europe the way it used to. So yes, there has been repeated failures locally. The United States hasn't been capable of getting congressional authorization. And as I said, even within NATO, there has been hesitation. We do remember that a lot of European countries have actually declined allowing American Air Force to use European airspace. So that is something that is very indicative. And going back to the comments, because this is a link to the question, your guest from Budapest I think what you said is extremely important. The ministerial meeting that happened in Cyprus is actually a clear example where some countries in the global north and in the global south have actually joined hands. For your viewers, if they don't recall what happened in Cyprus, you had, several Arab League countries from Jordan to Syria to Lebanon. You had the GCC Secretary General there. And they all collectively met outside of Washington-led frameworks. Okay, Washington wasn't there. I don't think Britain was there either. Surprisingly, those are the two architects of the old international system. Okay, so it does show a willingness by the Europeans, some European countries, and Arabs, and it shows a willingness to coordinate policies independently from Washington. And this actually fits into a larger trajectory. The conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran did not create the shift. I'm sure your guests would agree that Arabs have been, or the global South generally, has been for the past several years reconfiguring its alliances, expanding its economic partnerships beyond the United States. This is extremely clear when it comes to the GCC. Back in 2024, His Highness Emir Mohammed bin Salman in 2024 for the first time, this is the year 2024, announced the first time that they will no longer be selling oil strictly in US currency. Okay, and this is obviously a huge move for the petrodollar. So for those who keep saying that the petrodollar started collapsing now, I think the writing was already on the wall several years ago that there is an international shift happening. So yeah, Arab sales of energy being in Chinese yuan, trade investments in Africa and in Europe have deepened. So finally, for your last question, which is this a definitive end of the unipolar moment? I would argue humbly that is way too early to declare such a historical rupture based on one conflict, but I think the symbolism matters, because when Washington wants to secure domestic approval, and it can't, as you said, congressional approval was not authorized, when it cannot get together a coalition of the willing, when its NATO members and NATO allies close airspace, when Arabs oppose, that material symbolism, that material reality, I personally think is more important than any single battlefield outcome. That's where I would. That's what I would say in relation to that.
Clear, Dr. Qasimi. Now let me bring Professor Roja again. Professor Roja, if you come to look at what is happening, the different strategies applied in this conflict, what would you say about the strategy, or whatever they name it, a rational strategy of some sort, escalate to de-escalate? Do you think this is the wisest strategy actually to bring about a solution? Or as some Western analysts are claiming, this could be a sign of internal regime panic, let's say?
Well, I am not sure that there is an internal regime panic. The regime is there, the Velayat al-Faqih, the specific system, political model is still there. And we have heard about Iran getting ready for this kind of a war for several years now. Frankly speaking, no wonder, since ever since the Islamic Revolution, the aim of regime change has appeared on the American agenda time and again. Sometimes even in the state budget, there were separate titles for that aim. So I don't think that there would be a panic. We are speaking now about a mosaic strategy. that even geographically within the country and even in the hierarchical level also there are different levels, and there is always someone to step in. But this escalate to de-escalate is a very nice putting the idea which is explained by several colleagues, that the Iranians are very well aware that they cannot defeat the United States. So what they do is, I would like to quote someone, you don't need to defeat the adversary, you don't need even to match their power, you just have to make it too costly to sustain such a war or an operation. And I think this is the basic idea behind it, to raise the cost so high. And here when I say cost, I do not necessarily mean money-wise or even weapon-wise or even in economic losses. But also, I mean, attention. President Trump has so many issues on his desk, and we have seen him turn from here to there and even further. And in the meanwhile, we also know that China would be the great rival with whom he would like to settle things. So it is, I think he did not expect this war to become so long and the Iranians to be able to stay their place. And this is why this new strategy to escalate, to de-escalate would make sense from the Iranian point of view.
And now, Dr. Khuzai, from the Gulf perspective now, do you see Iran blinking or doubling down with this strategy of escalate to de-escalate? And do you think this is going to be costly not just for the USA, but also for the Gulf countries?
Well, today, President Pezeshkian asked the citizens of Iran to lower the electricity usage. Over the past 50 days, the death of the Grand Ayatollah and the disappearance of the new Ayatollah, most of the leadership were taken out. We're talking about the local disruptions and discount and mass executions, lack of income and economic failure somehow. The way the negotiations, on top of all of that, the way the negotiations has been going ever since last year, that resulted in the 12-day war. Then earlier this year, that resulted in the ongoing war. And then with the ongoing negotiations, give us some kind of a pattern. The way Iranians behave is always buying time, yet presenting nothing to the table. While with the Americans, they grant for the first time in history, especially when it comes to Iran, they grant even more time before hitting them hard. The way I see it, all of the above basically indicates and suggests that another hit is coming on Iran's way, and I'm not sure how it will be tolerated by the Gulf, because this will be another hit to the world's economy, to the Gulf, to Iran, and even on the United States itself. I think the coming days are going to be hard to follow.
And now, Dr. Raja, if we come to speak about who lost Europe, we've seen, for example, Chancellor Merz explicitly calling for easing the sanctions because of the energy fallout, while Washington tightens the blockade. Now, is this the moment the transatlantic alliance breaks on the question of war, according to you?
You think you see like Dr. Al-Qassemi has spoke on it, and very good points he raised. There are divisions, as I said. There are divisions within Europe, and because the war going on, ongoing war in Ukraine, and on different fronts. So I would see it from another angle. That is like, the both sides, as the panel members are saying here, both sides are buying time because The war, as you see, we see in the last decades, and particularly in the Middle East, and with the project, the Greater Israel Project, the Israelis are openly threatening other countries as well. So is one after the other country, what they are doing is now, which is why the Western, allies are beginning to at least understand this, that, this is Lebanon, then other countries, Yemen, and after that Syria, and then going to Iran and all that. Well, the world is Americans with their alliance, they in the West, they are pressing Iranians and stopping them to acquire nuclear weapons. But nobody is so seriously, coming up and raising the same question and asking this with the same intent to the Israelis who already have nukes. So there are divisions. There's no doubt. I agree with that, but it's too early to say. What kind of results we have in as a result of these divisions. Whether there will be peace or whether there will be more escalation, only time will tell.
Mm-hmm. And let me bring Dr. Al-Qasimi. Perhaps this goes back to the first question, but more importantly, I want to focus on a lawless unipolar order, Dr. Al-Qasimi. So if we see, for example, the EU finally rebuking the US, do you think that this perhaps retroactively validates the Global South accusations of a lawless unipolar order?
I think your guest from Budapest already emphasized a few points, which I think I'll bring them back up through the conversation. So I think if the EU pushes back, and it is against Washington, I don't think it's a sudden development. I think it is a product of accumulated frustration, which became more clear in the beginning of 2002 with the Ukrainian war. Okay, so since the Ukrainian war, as your guest has said, Europe has paid a substantial price. The CIA, in collaboration with the Ukrainian forces, blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And I think Seymour Hersh was one of the first journalists to actually highlight this. Yes, a few years ago, it was political scientists and journalists were not allowed to talk about the Nord Stream pipeline being blown up deliberately by the United States. But I think as journalists and as academics, we should call a spade a spade. And the United States did blackmail Europe through that. So Europe has paid a substantial price: energy shocks, inflation, political fragmentation, for a conflict that its leaders actually did not want. And if we can bring the Ukrainian conflict into what's happening right now, we see similarities. Arabs also didn't want the war in Iran. The Europeans didn't want the war with Ukraine. Yet it's the same actor, the United States, that made sure this war happened and escalated it. And in both cases, how many years did we see negotiations fail and come back between Ukraine and Russia? It started in Turkey, then those failed, then they went back and forth. And we see the same trend happening right now. So in both cases, the perception is that Washington initiates confrontation and then it just pulls out, and partners have to bear the costs. So I think this is why the Cyprus meeting was extremely important, because Arab states met their European partners, as coordinating actors. If Arabs weren't just spectators, objects at the table waiting to take orders, or vice versa, right? They were both European actors and Arab actors. They were both subjects who want to consolidate and reach a compromise together to enforce a specific policy. So Europe understands that it cannot afford a rupture with the Arab world, because the Ukrainian war already ruptured Europe's relations with Russia. Okay, and Europe depends on Gulf energy, LNG flows, Arab capital in its infrastructure and financial markets. I'm sure our guests are aware, and our viewers, that Arab countries, whether France and Egypt or Germany and Egypt when it comes to its railways, or the tens of billions of dollars that the GCC has invested in Europe, all of these are very important. So if Europe does rebuke Washington, it would do more than simply validate the global South's critique. I think it would just confirm that even America's closest partners, Europe, are no longer willing to absorb its consequences and its decisions, especially when they did not choose it. And especially since we're already in a world system, as clearly stated in the Munich Security Conference and the Davos meeting in Switzerland, that we're moving into a multipolar world. So I think Europe is no longer willing to, if you want, roll over in a sense.
Clear, Dr. Al-Qasimi. And now, Professor Roja, Quincy Institute and Cater Institute analysts are now actually openly calling this Israel's war, America's fight. Even figures within the Trump orbit are leaking frustration. So, is the U.S. foreign policy elite finally admitting this is a lost war that serves a foreign interest over American ones, according to you?
Well, this has been a narrative for quite a long time. Whenever there was a crisis in the Middle East, then we have had this narrative. But there are also symptoms of changing within the United States. And for example, I think in the first year of the Gaza war, President Trump himself warned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Israel is losing support within the American public, even among the Republicans. It seems that there is some change going on, and I think that this is a very important point. I wouldn't dare to say that Israel's war, America's fight, but definitely it does have the outlook of it. Mind you, if someone told that to President Trump, I think he would change his view again, maybe to another point. And I don't think that it will ever be acknowledged by the American political elite. What is sure is that whatever the end of this war will be, it will have to look as if it was a win. And I think that this is what President Trump aims to do too. He likes to show it to the world that this is an American win. When we heard at the beginning of the program, we heard President Trump speak. We heard that he was very strong and felt very much in the winning position. But in fact, I am not sure that President Trump has the time that he referred to. We all know that the United States is coming to midterm elections in November. We all know that President Trump's public opinion poll is going down. Probably there has never ever been an American president whose public opinion was so low, the public rate was so low. And we also hear it from the different public opinion polls that an increasing ratio of the American public is against this Iran war, not to mention the very basic fact that it was President Trump who campaigned for his presidency with the aim that never start a costly, faraway war, especially if it takes so long. So I think that from a point of view where it can be claimed that Israel's war and Americans fight, and especially how the 12-day war started last year and how this war started this year, when the delegations, the American and Iranian delegations, are sitting together negotiating, and in the meanwhile Israel attacked Iran last year, and then the United States joined in, and this happened again this year. But this year it was the United States who started from the beginning this war, frankly speaking, I would like to join the opinion of, I think it was Dr. Qasimi who was speaking about the world order. What kind of a world order we are going to? I mean, when you cannot believe you are talking to someone and in the meanwhile it attacks you. So I am very much afraid for the United States, but also for the world order from this point of view.
Thank you, Professor Roja. And now let me include Dr. Khuzai. Since you mentioned the negotiations, this part is linked to the comprehensive reply addressed by Iran, at least what it claims to have done. It says that its comprehensive reply did actually address the 10 points agreed upon, but then the nuclear file is or remains the elephant in the room, let's say. So if Islamabad fails, do you think Tehran crosses the threshold as a deterrent? And if so, what would that mean for the region's security architecture, Dr. Khuzai?
With Tehran still insisting that its comprehensive reply addresses the 10 points, as well with the nuclear issue remains unresolved, without any variable concessions, the elephant in the room, as you mentioned, overshadows all the other issues, leaving the process fragile and incomplete. If diplomacy collapses this time, whether through Islamabad's failure or even broader breakdown, Iran could still accelerate the enrichment. Cross the nuclear threshold, that move may and would be framed as deterrence, but in practice, it would surely destabilize the balance of power and embolden Tehran's posture. With all of that being mentioned, we have to understand that a nuclear-capable Iran would force the Gulf states and Israel to recalibrate their defense doctrines. That will be another issue for Iran and for the world. The 10 points that Iran keeps on slamming the Americans with is repetitive. It's the same points they have always been putting on the table. It's unrealistic as much as the American plan, as much as the American approach, but it does not change anything. And with them being under so much pressure, are these 10 points bound to change or not? That will tell how the next few days to 1 week will be at play.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khuzai. And as we are reaching the end of this special coverage, Dr. Raja, briefly, please, do you think the U.S. or is the U.S. victory at the Hormuz even achievable, or do you think it's an illusion?
That's a very difficult question, because looking back into the wars, since the time of Vietnam in Afghanistan, America has never won any war, to be honest, and that's according to a very fair comment, according to piles of evidence. So at the same time, it's saying that somebody having chip on their shoulders, coming to a faraway place and threatening the Iranians, who are backed by Russians, backed by Chinese, and no one in the global South in a position to afford the Iranians lose this war. So let's hope for the peace. That's the main thing. But at the same time, I think you're right to say the Americans and Israelis are no way winning this war.
Thank you
I won't
so
see
much.
it happening.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you so
Raja.
much.
My thanks goes to all our distinguished guests for their valuable insight tonight. Professor Elizabeth and Roja, Dr. Khalid Al-Qasimi, Dr. Irfan Raja, and Dr. Ahmed Khuzai. Thank you all for your valuable analysis for tonight. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A rules-based order is actually bleeding credibility in every ocean and marketplace. We're past the point of simply asking who controls the Strait of Hormuz. We're actually witnessing a live renegotiation of who controls the international levers of power. As the talks in Islamabad dangle by a thread and European allies publicly air their discomfort, we're reminded that in a truly multipolar world, the echo of double standards sounds a lot like the death knell of unaccountable hegemony. We remain at a historic crossroads, and the question remains, is this historic opportunity for just peace or for a great unraveling? From All 24 News, I'm Karim Fazakri. Thanks for watching. And until next time, do take care.